So when you look at the Iran war right now, there are some things that are much deeper and potentially much worse that are beginning to emerge from it. Because this is no longer feeling like a temporary crisis. It no longer looks like another Middle Eastern flare-up that eventually ends with, say, diplomacy, exhaustion, or a fragile agreement. Instead, what may be taking shape is something far more permanent, a conflict that never truly ends, but simply changes and becomes part of the international system itself. Because what seems to be happening isn't just this conflict between Iran, Israel, or the US. It's an emergence of a new model of conflict, a long war, one that never fully ends, but continually transforms, and where neither side concedes defeat, but neither side can fully achieve victory. It matters because within Iran itself, there is deliberation over whether to continue fighting. Political factions are debating over how to survive in a world where permanent confrontation is the new reality. Hardliners clashing with pragmatists, and elites disagreeing over negotiation details. The government is publicly projecting unity, while privately struggling with major strategic questions. And that internal debate matters because it reveals something much larger than itself. It's suggesting that modern wars increasingly do not conclude in any traditional sense, if at all. Instead, they become embedded into everything else that we take for granted. They evolve into long-term pressure campaigns, managed escalation, reoccurring crises, and this semi-perpetual instability. So in this video, I wanted to look at why the Iran conflict may never truly end, at least in the traditional sense. What is going on in Tehran with prolonged tensions and divisions over what may be more important to achieve than others, and how this represents a broader shift in the future of geopolitical tensions and conflict.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are you going, everyone? You're watching The Global Gambit, a channel focused on geopolitics, economics, international relations, and the big structural shifts that are happening around us, with particular emphasis on the war in Iran. But before beginning, I want to know, what do you think about the Iran situation? Does it lead to some kind of established settlement? Or are we entering a new era where, because fewer states actually declare war, fewer can claim peace and victory? Let me know in the comments. Now, the assumption for decades has been that wars end. One side wins, one side loses, or both sides become so exhausted enough that they find a compromise. But increasingly, and largely ever since the Second World War, less and less countries have officially declared war. More recent conflicts have shown us with Ukraine, Gaza, and now Iran is showing the same thing. The future of conflict may not be a decisive victory. Instead, it may be this perpetual instability. Wars that pause but never disappear. Negotiations that happen but without resolution, and conflicts that largely become normalized in the background of our everyday lives over time. The current ceasefire surrounding Iran has not actually resolved anything fundamental. The Strait of Hormuz is, of course, contested, sort of open but sort of closed. The nuclear negotiations, which is what largely much of this stem from, remain unresolved, and Iran's military systems still exist. Their proxy work still active, and neither side willing to surrender on their core or sometimes maximalist demands. And so this new dangerous dynamic emerges. Because if neither side can achieve victory, but neither side is willing to compromise, then the conflict just enters a sort of limbo, a status quo. And for Iran, as the recipient of this conflict of choice, it's particularly important. Because unlike many wars, this conflict is not simply about territory or military conquest. It's about leverage, as I've always emphasized in previous videos. The economic pressure, the energy routes, the political survival, the strategic planning, and of course the psychology of endurance. One of the most striking developments during the recent escalation has been how unified Iran initially appeared. As American and Israeli strikes intensified, Iran's rival factions temporarily rallied together. There are different factions within the IRGC and Islamic Republic, be them hardliners, moderates, restrainers. All of those publicly closed ranks and focused on their shared sense of survival. It's of course common in wartime. The British government did it with the Grand Government of National Unity, and when a state believes that it is under existential pressure. But ceasefires change political conditions and often in conflict benefit the defending side. When the bombs stop, the politics quickly returns, and that's exactly what did happen within the early phases of April. After the ceasefire came into effect, long-standing rivalries inside Iran's political surface system began resurfacing. The debate now centers around one issue, of course, above all. How should Iran approach the United States? Should it negotiate with it? And if so, in what capacity? On the surface, it sounds like a technical dispute, but it is effectively battle over Iran's identity and who ultimately defines the strategic direction of the country, be it more pragmatic and restrained or more hardline and aggressive. Mistakenly, many people in the West sort of look Iran as a monolith, where order flows downwards and everyone follows the same line. But as we've seen, and from the many guests I've interviewed, there are things such as horizontal escalations as well as vertical. Iran's political system is much more complicated, with overlapping power systems: the judiciary, the parliament, the presidency, the security institutions, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, or IRGC, being one of the biggest of all of them. All of these ultimately determine how much power brokerage there is, not simply the supreme leader. And they don't always agree. They're often competing, negotiating, and even undermining one another. Iran's political system is not democratic in the Western sense, but it's highly functional. It has to be for it to be as successful and adaptable as it has proven in the past 40 years. For decades, rival camps inside Iran have argued over how to preserve the Islamic Republic, and some believe confrontation. Others believe that just risks economic isolation and ultimate weakness. Others see ideology over pragmatism, but more recently, pragmatism seems to have dominated over the ideological forms. And those tensions come to the fray as Iran is facing one of its biggest strategic decisions. One reason uncertainty has grown is because of the Iran's new leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. As you may have heard me say in the past, he has a closer relationship, a more pragmatic approach to his father, Ali Khamenei, and his relationship with the IRGC is much more important. In authoritarian systems, visibility matters too, and leadership is not simply about formal authority, but about the perception. When a leader disappears from the public view, uncertainty increases, and there has been a lot of speculation whether Mossadegh was even alive. And so uncertainty, even if it's done for self-preservation, creates competition. Ali Khamenei was actually a bit of a glue, bringing together the ideological and pragmatic parts of the Iranian system. He spent years balancing competing factions and preventing internal rivalries from becoming destabilized. He understood the personalities involved. He knew how to manage conflict inside the system. And so stabilizing that role is harder to replicate during a national crisis, let alone when you've just been shoved into one of the most important positions in the world. Iran is navigating, therefore, an incredibly sensitive period where the military, economic, political, and diplomatic pressures are all overlapping at once. And it creates room for competing interpretations of what the leadership truly wants, but also what it should really be focusing on. At the center of this dispute is someone else known as Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who is the Iran's parliamentary spokesman and someone who's become a lot more prominent since the conflict fully took off. He's been one of the key vocalists during talks with American officials in Pakistan, but his involvement has also sparked backlash from Iran's other factions, namely their hardliners. These hardliners argue that negotiations themselves are pointless, dangerous, and counterproductive, and for them that diplomacy with Washington is not simply engagement, it's appeasement, it's vulnerability, and ultimately that America, much like the Americans think of Iran, only respond to force and maximalist demands. There has been public arguments over negotiations as being pure damage and claiming that Iran should just skip the talks entirely, try to milk as much as possible the situation in the Strait of Hormuz and the broader economic and reputational impacts on the United States. Now, accusations over legitimacy and perceived loyalty are other issues. Political disagreement is one thing, but appearing to challenge ideological authority is something much more serious and goes to the heart of what the Islamic Republic is built on. The debate, therefore, goes beyond just diplomacy, and it becomes a question of who gets to define Iran's strategic future. To understand hardliners' positions, for example, it is important to recognize how they interpret Iran's position in history. From their perspective, negotiations have always repeatedly weakened Iran. They point to the previous JCPOA nuclear talks, the temporary sanctions relief, Western promises that eventually collapsed, military threats that continued even during periods of diplomacy or peacetime. So in their view, compromise does nothing to bring security, only brings exposure and being stabbed in the back. It's why some factions prefer genuinely prolonged conflict, protracted conflicts, which are asymmetrical in nature and somewhat delinked. Negotiation creates ambiguity, and ambiguity creates risk, the very worst thing for Iran in its present situation. Now, before continuing, guys, I wanted to say that this video is brought to you by, well, you guys, actually. Those of you who support me as members, patrons, or the occasional coffee, you really make it possible to do what I do and have arranged some of the super exciting events that are coming up. And I encourage you to stick around for on the channel by subscribing and giving the video a like. Clicking that bell when we've got guests like NATO Commander Wesley Clark, General Mick Ryan, and of course, Sarah Payne, all coming back on the channel. But back to the video. Now, this is where the story becomes much bigger than internal Iranian politics. That's just a case study. Iran may actually have incentives to maintain that controlled level of instability, not full-scale war or endless bombing, but this permanent state of leverage pressure. From Tehran's perspective, time is its biggest asset. Iran understands important things about the United States. America always struggles. Democracies struggle with prolonged wars. Domestic political pressure builds, the public attention shifts, and the economic pressures, albeit relative to what Iranians are struggling with, grow. They've watched how Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Syria, anywhere that America has been caught up in, have impacted the American psyche and therefore the ballot box. And so it creates a dangerous asymmetry. Iran does not necessarily need to win. It never really has needed to. It's just all about needing to outlast, which of course is where the most important area is the Strait of Hormuz. It's one of the most critical energy choke points with a significant proportion of energy flowing through it. It gives Iran something incredibly valuable, that disruption power. Much like Russia, Iran influences things by purely being disruptive, not necessarily by outright winning. It's very cheap to interfere in political elections or through proxy networks. And Iran understands that it can do this better than ever through the financial and, most of all, energy markets. Oil markets react instantly. Shipping insurance costs rise, inflation pressure returns, and governments panic. And so the Iranians don't need to, and have never needed to, beat the Americans militarily. They just have to create such perpetual uncertainty that it forces the American government of all to change approach. Now, in Iran's most recent proposal, we get a sense of what they think Washington really wants. Not necessarily the regime change or leadership change, as Trump unadvisedly claimed at the beginning of the conflict, nor complete strategic dominance, simply a restored predictability, the reopening of the shipping lanes, the calmer energy markets, and a sense of economic confidence. Because if Iran can continue to pressure that, then the Americans really don't have as much long-term leverage, no matter what they claim. For Donald Trump, it creates a complicated dilemma. Military escalation is easier, and it sounds great. He likes the bombs and boomies, but if Washington escalates aggressively, Iran can simply retaliate and just does so in a minimal way. We've seen reports of that the Americans have used much higher amounts of their stockpiles and have put their need to replenish them 1 to 2 years behind. And if there is to be some potential conflict with China over Taiwan, then this is the worst situation for the United States military to be in. So their conflict becomes cyclical. Pressure, negotiation, back down, escalation, pause, and then repeat. This is all ongoing, and, well, I could see this happening for months on end. And it explains why the financial markets continue to underestimate how long the Iran confrontation could last. Many still assume that there will eventually be a decisive diplomatic breakthrough, and why I have a problem with the short-termist approach of financial analysis sometimes. Even if a nuclear agreement were to be established, major disputes remain unresolved. What happens to its missile program, regional militias, proxies, Israel's security concerns, and generally that bilateral relationship, which seems hell-bent on continuing regardless of what the United States and Iran agree. None of these are going to disappear with one agreement, and if anything, they're likely to remain unresolved indefinitely. It matters because while diplomacy may reduce tensions over a couple of more well-known elements, the bits that are mainly in the headlines, there's far many more detailed layers that contribute to everything else that ultimately are not being looked at in greater depth. Ceasefires bring breathing space, but they certainly do not enough to resolve the systemic challenges, which is what keeps leading to the conflict in the first place. Then, of course, we can't get away without mentioning China. Another reason this conflict may continue is because of China. China remains one of Iran's most important economic lifelines, and even under the sanctions or pressure, Tehran still maintains access to trade networks and revenue streams. It became evident early on in April that China had been providing military systems and advice Iran in a way that it hadn't been for any other country in recent memory. China provides that breathing room and makes it much harder for the conflict to end. If Iran can continue to absorb the strategic pressure because of its own military replenishment, then that makes it even more costly and complicated for the United States. So if Tehran believes it can survive economically, it becomes far less desperate for compromise and only increases, especially amongst hardline opinions, of the capacity to outlast and simply just overwhelm the United States through strategic endurance, through strategic patience. Traditional models assumed about wars are that they conclude. Modern conflicts increasingly do not, and we've seen that the growing direction towards military armament, as well as the quantity of conflicts, as well as their magnitude, has grown in the past few years. Pressure replaces resolution, and states increasingly aim not to win, but to simply shape behavior over time and absorb the costs. This is what we now be witnessing between the US and Iran, a conflict that evolves into infrastructure rather than event, something embedded in the international something that governments learn to manage rather than solve. You could argue that's the case with the war in Ukraine, and it may become one of the most defining geopolitical realities of the next 10, 20, perhaps 50 years. The debate inside Iran is not about whether to negotiate, it's about how to survive in a world where confrontation never fully disappears. And above all, politics, economics, and conflict are all increasingly intertwined in a way that they never had really been ever before. The biggest takeaway is that Iran's conflict isn't temporary anymore. It's arguably a semi-permanent condition that we're all just sort of getting used to. And ultimately, the new price levels, the cost of living, inflation, and everything that we're talking to each other on a daily basis is something that is just standard now. It may be a preview of how future conflicts increasingly operate, longer, messier, murkier, and permanently suspended between war and peace. But that's it from me, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, then do give the video a subscribe and a like. It really helps. It's free. And click on this video next, because it connects directly to the big story behind this conflict, escalation, and nature of global conflict. Take care.